Welcome and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nomad Winterhawk, pronounced Nadasti. I am here from one of the nations around the Four Corners region. We settled here in the Americas about 5000 BC. We've had many adventures from our journey here. We arrived on the Texas southern coast, came up the Pecos River, and went westward. When we got to further rivers, we continued and even got into the Colorado River and traveled toward Southern California, along the area where today there are nations called Kimawave, nations called Luiseno, which are still part of our nations. We developed various languages by encountering other peoples along our journeys, but basically we speak our language. Our language is based on what we call ourselves. We call ourselves Nuvu, which means the people. Nu means water, and Vu means coming from the water. So we say we're the people coming from the water. So today I've been asked to speak about several things. One of those things has to do with the timelines of variations. Variations can be placed in a particular meaning when we talk about genetic variants of gene stock and phenotypes. If I was talking about plants, the seeds would be called a variant. If we have yellow corn, if we have corn, which is in its genotypic state, it has different colors: white, yellow, red, turquoise. Some have stripes, some have dents, some are shriveled up because they're sweet, and others are more hard and lucent, shiny, basically. Anyway, if I take one of those variations, for example, yellow starch corn, I plant just the yellow starch in a field. In that field, only yellow starch will grow as a corn. When it grows the first year, it's not as large as the genotype. It's very much smaller. And year after year, I take the seeds from this and I plant them again. Year after year, these grow larger until they come to the point of stabilization. After that, the stabilization is lost and they become smaller and smaller each season and move toward infertility. This happens as well with many other situations. A variant is not the gene stock. The gene stock helps the plant to change, to overcome various conditions of the soil, of the weather. I work with different groups who are everywhere from Sicily to Scandinavia. In Sicily, some of the people there have 38 different variations of an ancient wheat-like crop. Some of these variations grow in very dry conditions, other in wet conditions, others in various types of soil conditions. The soil can be calcareous, it can be like clay, almost like cement, or it can be very fertile. So whatever condition, whatever weather pattern that they have in those situations, they use the seed, the variation, to grow in that situation, but they only grow that particular variation. In the EEC, the European Common Market, they only allow 10 of those variations to be used with the rest of the common market. From different countries, they send all of the seeds together to a local pool where they're ground up, made into flour or other things, and then sent back to the various nations. But in Sicily, they keep the other ones. They haven't destroyed the other variations that they've found that are leading toward the genotype. And again, I'm making a point here. The variations start at a point, they come up to stabilization, they return to infertility. This is also valid with animals and with humans. If you imagine the gray wolf is responsible for all of the dogs that we have on the planet. Very long ago, we took the pups, the babies, from these gray wolves, and we kept them with us. At those times in a cold climate, the wolves were not outside in the winter, so their feet didn't adjust to not freezing anymore. They had to be around us and around heat. Over time, their muzzle changed, their legs and their body changed. And what we did as humans were we mixed different characteristics of these changes together. If there were pups that were aggressive, we would kill those and we would keep the docile pups so that we had a friendlier animal that today you know is the local dog that you have. The problem, again, with the animals is the same with the seeds. They start at a particular point where they're a variation. They come to a point of stabilization and they descend to a point of infertility. And at this time, many dogs around the planet are being manipulated by their blood and their DNA to keep them actively here and present. Many of those dogs no longer reproduce the way they used to reproduce. This is also the same with human beings. And this comes to my point of why I'm speaking tonight. Someone had asked me to speak about Glodgers' law and what that has to do with humanity. I'll speak about it because many people research different aspects of various cultures around the world. One of the things that you must know is that Africa, if you've ever seen a real image of Africa, not the doctored images to make Africa look smaller, it's 1/5 of the land mass of the planet. 1/5, that's a lot of land. But in Africa, there's two belt zones, one called the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. In that equatorial place between those belts is where all life on the planet began. Insects, birds, mammals, lizards, and humans. When we began as Homo sapiens, we began in that hot belt. We began about minus 230,000 BC. By 200,000 BC, there were 6 varieties of Homo sapiens. We have all of the characteristics that any type of humanity has on the planet, from albinoism to blue-black, from straight hair to curly hair to wavy hair, dark hair, red hair, blonde hair, brown eyes, green eyes, blue eyes. All of these are characteristics of African people. We're not just black Africans. We have all of the characteristics of humanity. These characteristics in the humans that were in that area were classified in 6 different variations. The first variation is called the elongated variation. Then there is the Nilotic, the Khoisan, the Twa, the Broad West African. There's another one. I've forgotten the name temporarily, but I'll come back to it. There are 6 different variations. Nilotic, Twa, cartoon. The cartoon variant was the one I forgot. Coming back to these variations, we all had a particular characteristic being in that tropical zone. All of the animals in that area, they were this was discovered earlier by a man named Glodger. He went there to study animals and plants, and he noticed that certain characteristics remained with different animals and plants. Later it was experimented on his rule, and it became known as Glodger's law. It's meaning all hot-blooded mammals in that area, it used to be just warm-blooded animals, but hot-blooded mammals secrete a chemical called eumelanin, which darkens the skin. If you're in a very hot area, you secrete more eumelanin and you're very, very dark. If you're in an area which is not as hot, you diminish the production of melanin, you become browner, lighter skin colored. This is something that happens with people that are of the genotype of humanity. As Africans left Africa and they began to go along the coastal areas into Oceania and then eventually up into Asia, when they were in Asia, some went westward. They were surrounded by an ice sheet. There were others that went further north, the Inuits, the Lapps, the Samis. But the ones that were surrounded by the ice sheet from 40,000 BC, 22,000 years later, to minus 18,000 BC, came to the point of stabilization. That was 22,000 years. Right now, where they're at is at 20,000 years. What happens in 2,000 years from now? It's possible that they won't exist anymore as a being on this planet. And for that reason, at this time, many unusual types of sicknesses are beginning to appear. These sicknesses, in many aspects, refer to how these people are formed. The same sicknesses don't apply to people that are African. But in this area, for example, 10 years ago, 1 in 5,000 women had a disease that was named after 4 doctors. MHRK is the name of the disease. This means that when a young woman was born, she had all of the structures, but some of the structures were not complete. For example, when a young woman came to the age of adolescence, when she'd have her moon cycle, and her moon cycle didn't come, then one of the specialists would come to examine. When he separated her vaginal lips and looked in, he noted that there was no urethra, the area where a woman usually pees through, and there was no vaginal canal. All of these things found alternate directions. The vaginal canal was closed. The ovaries were intact, but there were no connection going into the uterus. There was no uterus. The uterus was incomplete. There was no vaginal canal. Some of these things could be affected by surgery to correct, but basically this is a disease that's moving toward infertility. Right now, at this time, 10 years later, it's 1 in 2,000 women that's of European descendancy that has that particular situation. With the people in East Asia, the ones that became Eastern Asian Oriental phenotypes, they began about 30,000 BC and stabilized at minus 8,000 BC. They have 12,000 years to go still. There were other variations that formed in that time. When you think of the people in the north, the Inuits, the Lapps, Samis, Eskimos, they were able to keep some of their coloration because they ate animals from the land and they could get fish from the ocean. So they got amino acids for the vitamin D. With Glodger's law, when we are out in the sun and we have this darker skin color, the darker skin color from the melanin protects us from ultraviolet radiation. It doesn't protect people with lighter skin from ultraviolet radiation. But it's also a disadvantage if we happen to be in Asia, in a northern area. We need more sunlight. It's cold, and usually the custom is to wear clothes on your body if it's cold. You don't go around in a loincloth anymore. So if you don't get enough sunlight, you have a problem. The sun shining on the skin, on dark skin, penetrates the skin. It mixes with a substance in our body called 7-dihydrocholesterol that creates vitamin D through the liver, which is necessary for calcification of the bones. Basically, this is why Glodgers' law is so important in that sense. So many times when you hear about the chronology of the various sites around the world, it's very important to note what the time period was through carbon dating of the bones or the artifacts, and that helps you to understand who was possibly there at that particular time. If you think about the early Americas, for example, because that's my area of speciality, in the Americas, anything that was before 20,000 BC, it was obvious that this was Africans. Anything after that time period, it can be debatable and questioned. The theory that's proposed by most scholars is that around 12,500 people from Asia traveled into the Americas across the Bering Straits. They went inland where there was ice that became water and it was impassable. But the theory is that they came inland and they descended down toward the Great Lakes area and the Great Plains, or others came along the coast. But what actually happens at 12,500 BC is that there were no Asiatic types on the planet yet. So at 12,500 BC, the people that were in Alaska, Canada, all the way down to Tierra del Fuego, they were African. If you find out through an article by archaeologists today, they so badly want these early people to be what they call American Indian, the first inhabitants. They weren't the first inhabitants, but they try and use whatever they find to say this is representing the Native American, the indigenous, the first inhabitants of the Americas. There was one recently that was found, a dig site in Canada that was found, and it goes back to maybe 14,000 BC. Going back to 14,000 BC, that gives you an indication of who those people possibly were. It's on the East Coast, so I imagine it could have been people that were connected to the Inuits, the Eskimos, some of those people from northern Scandinavia or Greenland who crossed over. But as well, remember that many of those people were also still African. Some of the other sites on the East Coast, Meadowcroft in Virginia, 19,000 BC, it should be clear who is there. Topper in South Carolina, 51,000 BC. If you go to Tolaquila in Mexico, 40,000 BC. If you go down to South America, you find other locations. In the Amazon, 54,000 BC. And if you go down further, Minas Gerais, maybe anywhere from 11,000 to 8,000 BC. It gives you an idea of who those people were. They found the skeletons of those people in Minas Gerais. They made different studies by different experts and found out that indeed they were an African people. What do you hear about African people? They were very primitive. They weren't able to cross the Atlantic. But many of these situations have shown a big difference in that situation. So, this is an understanding, a little bit of an understanding of Glodger's law and the role that it plays in looking at chronology and early groups of people. I appreciate your attention and thank you for listening.